Forspoken is an upcoming open-world action RPG from Luminous Productions, a studio that consists of many of the same people who made Final Fantasy XV. This is a brand new IP, which is always exciting, and upon initial reveal, there was a lot of buzz around this game, with its flashy visuals and particle-heavy combat against some pretty cool-looking enemies, all set in what appears to be a vast medieval-inspired open world. First impressions of Forspoken, at least for me, were fairly positive. Although the tone has shifted a bit with time, and there are some decent concerns that we'll touch on later, all in all, I still think this game looks pretty darn solid from what we've seen, especially after the gameplay footage we got not too long ago. I am quite looking forward to Forspoken coming out later this year. So let's dive in and check out the game, everything they've shown, and what we know so far about Forspoken. Now again, the basics are that this is an open world action RPG with a big focus on traversal and magic-based combat that you'll be using while fighting otherworldly fantasy creatures. The game's story goes like this. You play as Frey, a girl from modern-day New York, who all of a sudden finds herself transported to a strange land filled with deadly, oversized fantasy creatures and also other humans native to the world who question why and how exactly you got there. So you're trying to find a way home while also being wrapped up in the problems of the people of Athia, who are dealing with this recent cataclysmic event called the Break, a storm that altered the entire world. Frey, for mysterious reasons, is the only one immune to the storm and able to go out and combat the dangers within, and thus the stage is set. Also, there is Cuff, this bracelet that appears on your arm when you first arrive. It's your source of magical powers and also acts as your companion. You'll be chatting with it, and it'll be there with you the entire time you play. So I really want to start by diving into the action combat, as this is clearly one of the major attempted selling points of Forspoken. It is certainly at the very least what they focused on the most in a lot of the preview coverage. Combat centers around the use of magic with a variety of spells with different capabilities, close combat, ranged, trap, and ambush abilities, which also utilize these different types of elements. Now, while engaged with enemies, you will be cycling between your different abilities, which you can do so on the fly with a radial menu that will also slow down time while you're swapping. So you could throw out a fireball and then swap to a tornado, summon that up, and then maybe you swap to a meteor, call it down, and blow everyone up. You could also summon in these lava creatures to help fight by your side. All of this with a ton of really good-looking particle effects. I mean, they're really pretty. Might be a little overboard, but I do think they look good. Spells are also broken up into 3 distinct categories represented by the triangle in the corner of the UI. Each one of these points designate a different spell type. There is attack magic, support magic, and your ultimates. Attack magic, as the name implies, is focused on dealing damage, with the different attacks being better suited for certain enemy types. This is what we would consider your basic attacks. They've got no cooldowns or restrictions. They are spam. There are multiple combo phases, and they can also be charged in a lot of instances. Some examples of attack magic include Shot, a small bullet-like blast that's akin to throwing rocks, Slice, which conjures up a magical fiery sword, Bolt, where you lob this blue ice orb, or Dart, these greenish knife-like bursts that will spring from your hand. Support magic, on the other hand, offers a variety of more defensive, control-focused effects to aid you in battle. This is a bit more potent than attack magic, and as such, these also have cooldowns that you will have to juggle. There is Bind, which will summon up vines to tangle your foes, rooting them in place. Prime places a magical trap in a spot of your choosing that will explode when stepped on. Charge launches you towards enemies in an explosive burst. Legion will summon up a horde of these flame Atronachs to fight by your side, and Maelstrom summons a watery pillar in a designated spot that protects against ranged attacks. And then finally, there are the ultimate abilities, the tip of the triangle. These are your strongest spells. They will deal a ton of damage and also have very long cooldowns, where there's Conflagration, which will call in this massive wall of lava that just sweeps over the enemies, melting them. Tempest summons a huge storm of lightning that you call down. And these are just a few examples, not only of the ultimates, but of all 3 spell types. The game has quite a few and a big variety of different spells. Now, with these also comes this system of elemental affinities. As I mentioned, the different spells are made up of these different elements. Now, there are certain enemies in the game that will be resistant to or weak against these various element types, and you will want to learn and use these to your advantage. You may come across an ice golem that's weak to fire, or a stone dragon that's weak to lightning, etc., etc. And this seems like a big part of the game's combat will be the experimentation and learning what spells work best against each enemy type. It does appear as well that there will be some sort of comboing in the game where maybe you will set up an enemy applying some elemental debuff and then follow that up with another spell that synergizes with it and does enhanced damage. Mixing of spells will be a thing too, where you can take one spell and then apply the elemental bonuses of another one to it. And there's also this system of kind of breaking the enemy, where if you do enough damage or break a stamina meter, they will then go in this down state, which you are then prompted to be able to exploit, which allows you to deal a huge burst of damage. So that's a bit about the game's combat. Now let's dive in and talk about the open world, the play space that you're going to be spending your time in. Now, the game is story driven. This is a story heavy game with a main narrative that drives you through and is your main source of progression, but it is not a linear game. Forspoken features this massive open world with expansive environments for you to traverse, and we've seen a lot of this in some early footage. In this space, you'll encounter enemies, find loot, uncover secrets, go to various points of interest, and a whole lot more. The world consists of various realms, think zones, with their own unique look and theming. So a few examples, we've seen things like large open plains, forest and mountains, deserts, castles, ruins, and abandoned cities. A lot of the traditional fantasy variety of locations that you would expect. There will also be big areas within there. So for example, we've seen footage of the Sideways City, this sprawling castle town that, as the name implies, has been twisted and warped. Every area in this game, every zone, every major point of interest will have their own distinct characteristics kind of along these same lines. Now, beyond combat itself, another major aspect to this game is the traversal system. You're going to see this showcased a lot in footage of this game, and it's just really basically you will be moving around very quickly through the environment. You can zip around the map with the ability to sprint, dodge and teleport, slide, glide, and mantle up all of the game's terrain. There are other traversal options as well. You have this grapple where you can hook onto other objects in the environment, propelling you up and forward. There's this hover surfboard that you'll summon up when you're crossing water. You also have a slow fall ability to help catch yourself from falling. The game does have fall damage, by the way, so you'll need to be careful. And to mention that, a lot of moves are also gated by your magic pool. Specifically, we know that slow fall is, so you'll have to be careful with how you use up this resource and use these movement skills wisely to make sure that you don't run out when you need the most. If you're falling, you want to make sure you have that slow fall to catch your fall and not die from damage. Within this world, you will come across a wide variety of fantasy enemy types. There's altered wildlife like these elk and bears, wolves and harpies. There's zombie creatures, these humanoids that were warped by the storm, elementals, magic infused creatures, and each of these enemy types with their own suite of attacks and abilities that you'll learn as you fight them, including these heavy hitting skills indicated by this little purple shimmer that you see here that they will do just before casting. In most cases, you will want to dodge whatever comes next. Also, the enemies in the game will come in 3 possible tiers, which is meant to represent how much they've been altered and corrupted by that storm, the break. The best way to think of this is like the traditional RPG enemy tier system: basic, mid, and elite enemies. The more corrupted they are, the harder they are. Besides the basic enemy types, we of course have bosses, and we've seen loads of different types of bosses. One of the primary ones, though, are the Tantas. These are magical sorceresses who at one time were good, but then turned evil and are now ruling the lands of Athia, making the lives of its inhabitants miserable. These will be your main targets, the things that you're working towards, tracking down and defeating in the game. One of the ones revealed so far was the Tanta of Justice. Previously ruling the courts fairly, she now finds everyone guilty and sentences them to death, basically, so you're gonna have to help and deal with that. Now, the Tantas, which are considered, again, major bosses in the game, also have these underlings that you'll have to clear before fighting them. In the footage released so far, we've seen one such underling enemy, the Pitiless Arbiter. She's protecting this bridge that you have to cross. She carries these scales, each side of it holding a different element, and in the footage we saw her enhance her axe with water, and then she did some water attacks, and then she enhanced her axe with ice and did a few ice attacks. On top of that, she had a few of what looked to be whirlwind style abilities, and she also had lots of health. This was a fairly interesting looking mini boss. There's also a host of large, oversized creature bosses. We saw different kinds of dragons, like this undead dragon. There was this fire-breathing dragon, various elemental creatures, these spectral behemoths, all sorts of very, very large boss battles, which looked pretty cool in this early footage. Other things to do in the open world besides, going around, doing the traversal and fighting enemies and bosses. There are various side quests and activities. There are these things called break storms, which are basically world events. An intense storm will roll in. This calls in a ton of challenging enemies for you to fight, and these will grant you nice rewards. And there are points of interest like the guild towers, these large multi-story towers full of books and resources and various enemies and loot. You'll also find various objects in these where they'll give you a bit of lore and backstory, but then also reveal locations on your map. So for example, you might find a book that talks about this town that was attacked and overtaken, and then you might then get the location of that town on your map where you can then move to it and go check it out. There are also these refuges scattered around the world that act as shelters where you can go to take a break. You can craft and upgrade your gear here. You'll find collectibles with lore and other world information, and you'll also be able to fast travel between these different refuge locations. There are treasure chests in the game. Sometimes you'll come across these, and when you go to open them, they will spawn in enemies you'll have to fight first. And there are also collectible resources, flowers, herbs, and other materials that'll be used in the game's crafting, doing things like making yourself health potions. And finally, I want to mention that the game does have something like a dungeon system, these unique locations that you'll go into and fight through enemies, going through different corridors, finding resources and other collectibles as you move, and then it all culminates with a boss battle at the end, in which, of course, you collect loot. Speaking of which, there is some gear customization and progression that we know of that we can mention here. So as you play, you'll defeat enemies and open those treasure chests that I mentioned and defeat bosses, and all of this will have you finding things like cloaks and necklaces, other accessories, and even nail patterns, all of which will grant you different bonuses when equipped. This is basically a traditional RPG gear system with the various items catering to different playstyles. Presumably there will be gear sets that will focus on enhancing certain types of elemental damage, or enhancing close range or ranged abilities, or traps, or maybe focusing on stealth play, giving you critical surprise damage, things along those lines. More RPG mechanics include the fact that there is a level system. You'll gain experience as you do things in the game, and then you will level up. In some footage we saw after fighting one of the mini bosses, Frey leveled up, gaining +1 magic, in which the game said Frey's magical powers have increased. I'll just assume this means it made her damage dealing spells better. There are also monuments out in the world that you will find and interact with, granting you upgrade stats when you do. All in all, this sounds like a pretty cool open world action RPG. Go out, you'll have the main story path and progression, you'll encounter NPCs that have cutscenes and things like that, and then you'll go out into the world, tracking down the different bosses, coming across side bosses, mini events, dungeons, world events, collectibles. It's gonna have a lot of the open world RPG stuff that you would expect. And all in all, I think it sounds like a pretty cool game. Like, a lot of these features are more or less what you expect. I like the look of the game. The action combat looks pretty good, but there are quite a few concerns that I just want to touch on here, because despite the game looking great to me, there are some things people have mentioned are worrying. For one, how empty the world is. In a lot of these traversal scenes that they've showcased, Frey does seem to be moving through a mostly barren landscape. Now, given the speed of movement that the game seems to have, it does make sense that they would want to build a large, expansive world that you can move through with how quickly you are moving. We just have to hope, of course, that it's not empty most of the time, as it does appear to be the case in the trailers. Should you decide to stop halfway through as you're moving through a field, ideally there will be stuff to do, to see, or to fight in a lot of these locations. Also, the performance. Some people have raised concern about this early footage having poor frame rates. Hopefully this is ironed out before the full release. Now, the newest footage that we saw looked a lot better with fewer frame drops, so I'm hoping that that's a good sign that they are working on performance. And then also difficulty. The game's combat has looked simple to a lot of people, with enemies kind of just soaking up damage and not seeming to do too much. They do have those heavy attacks that you can dodge, but we've never seen in a lot of the footage that's been released Frey come up against what appears to be a challenging fight. Even that mini boss, that underling boss on the bridge, seemed pretty simple and basic. Now, I should mention though that the game does have difficulty settings with an easy, medium, medium, and hard option. Likely, I don't know, scaling up the health and damage and hopefully even the awareness and reactivity of the enemies. That is just a guess though. We have got no confirmation as to what these different difficulty settings actually change, but we will of course hope for the best. And I should mention as well, it does seem like the elemental combat system with the different elements and the potential of comboing them and priming skills with other elemental effects does seem like there could be some depth there. So hopefully that keeps things engaging. And I think one of the primary final concerns that I should mention is the game's price. People are not loving the fact that it is representing a shift in AAA premium pricing. Quickly though, I should mention when it comes to this game's release, it was originally scheduled to launch on May 24th and then it got pushed back due to the usual reasons. They say that they just want to make the game as good as it can possibly be. And of course, that is great. It is now scheduled to launch on October 11th of this year, and it's coming to the PC and PS5. Now, there were some rumors not too long ago that Square Enix could possibly delay the game again. The rumor was that they would do so in favor of releasing Final Fantasy 16 this year instead. However, those rumors now seem to be squashed because we have gotten word that Final Fantasy 16 will in fact be releasing in 2023. So hopefully they're still on track for Forspoken to come out this year. And yeah, the price, base version of the game is going to cost $69.99, $70. This is a clear early example of a title embracing what could potentially be the industry-wide shift towards higher priced AAA games. That is a lot of money. I guess on the plus side though, Square Enix has confirmed that Forspoken will not have microtransactions of any kind, although there will be DLC. There is a digital deluxe version of the game for $95. It includes things like a mini art book, a soundtrack, but then also prequel DLC, which will be coming out in spring 2023, some months after the game's launch. So DLC is already lined up and can be purchased before the game is even out. All in all, I know there's a lot of concerns and there's some things that I'm genuinely worried about. I am worried about how empty the world feels. Although I feel like with how quick moving the game's traversal system looks to be, I mean, you are just blazing across these environments from what we've seen. I can deal with some open, empty space. It doesn't have to be loaded with enemies. If there's some like travel spaces in between those points of interest, I'm kind of okay with that. But hopefully it's not just barren with nothing. At the very least, we hope there will be things to find and discover, resources to collect. We know that's going to be a thing, but hopefully scattered around those open spaces are little interesting spots for you to find and not just be moving from kind of one encounter to the next. And the price thing, you know, it does suck if we're going to really see a baseline jump, although the way games are monetized nowadays, this feels like the lesser of multiple evils that exist out there, especially coming off of the back of all of this Diablo Immortal stuff and how like heavily monetized that game is. Although that's a phone game, kind of targets a different market. But either way, I don't know. If this game's not gonna have microtransactions, but is $10 more than the usual AAA game, I don't know that that's the end of the world for me. Although the pre-purchasing of DLC pre-launch, I don't love that either. But all in all, point is, there are some things that have me wary, but I am still genuinely looking forward to this game. I love the look of the combat, and it looks like a cool and interesting world to explore. I'm hoping everything else comes together as well. That does it for today. Thank you guys for checking out this early look at Forspoken. Hope you enjoyed the video. As always, I'll see you next time.